You big stupid jellyfish.
You know, I'm always really surprised when I see how many people think that Ilberd is some sort of tactical genius. That he's some crazed mastermind, that he did everything right and got exactly what he wanted. All because he had plans within plans within plans. When in reality, Ilberd was really impulsive and really stupid. So, let's come together and understand why I thought Ilberd was a complete idiot. So, the biggest offense I usually see for Ilberd is that he ultimately got exactly what he wanted. He got the city-states of Eorzea to fight the Garlean Empire and ultimately liberate Ala-Mhigo. If you want to look at this at face value, then yeah, sure, he got exactly what he was going for. But when you take into account his methods, reasons, and ultimately the placement of the pieces on the board, it wasn't a hard sell in the first place. You have to remember, this is pre-Shadowbringers Garlemald we're talking about. They mongered war all over the place. So trying to incentivize them to fight another country wasn't exactly difficult. If you poke a bear enough times, eventually it will rake your face off. It doesn't exactly take a high IQ to cause that to happen, just like how an idiot such as Ilberd would still be able to spark a conflict between nations. Like I said, this was the biggest export for the Garlean Empire. War! They mongered it! So obviously reigniting that tension between Eorzea and the northern nation of Ilsabard wasn't going to be difficult. So no, Ilberd wasn't some genius who got exactly what he wanted. He was a hopeless madman flailing in the dark trying to get anything to work. And you start to understand this once you start to get an appreciation for Ala-Mhigan history. So, what's so special about the nation of Ala-Mhigo that made Ilberd so desperate to save it in the first place? Well, let's go through a brief account of Ala-Mhigo's history and try and get an understanding of this moron's logic. Ala-Mhigo was formed in the early 1100s by Anshelm Cotter in the Sixth Astral Era. So all in all, Ala-Mhigo was only ever about 400 years old. Not an old city-state, but not an entirely new one either. The first major problem Ala-Mhigo faced was their choice of location. Garabanya can be inhospitable even at the best of times. The ground is dry, the weather is arid, so it's not easy to farm or raise livestock. So, how did Ala-Mhigo survive? By being the gateway to the north, of course. Ala-Mhigo was precariously placed right between Eorzea and Ilsabard. By acting as a sort of natural barrier between the two continents, they were able to regulate trade between them. You have to understand, city-states like Thavnair had already existed and traded with the borders of Ilsabard long into history already. So the idea of simply just traveling a little further westward and then into Eorzea for additional trade was an easy choice. They built their entire economy off of being the gate nation between continents. High taxes, high tariffs, everything was built to profit from Ala-Mhigo's location. But this was Ala-Mhigo's first mistake. They relied way too heavily on the coin coming in through trade that they didn't really focus on anything else. This is why it was a huge problem when, in less than 100 years, Ul'dah rose to prominence and began sea trade, completely skipping over the northern border. No one was taxing the ocean, so Ul'dah was able to make bank off of naval trade, and was the biggest reason their city-state began to flourish unlike any other. Now that Ul'dah had ships going from places like Thavnair to their very own borders, Ala-Mhigo's economy suffered for it. Mind you, this happened in the late 1100s. Between the late 1100s and the late 1400s, Ala-Mhigo isn't responsible for any major historical event, at least not on the world stage. So, as their economy slowly started to fold in on itself, they made no real attempts to change their course, which was ultimately their biggest mistake. Sure, Alamigo was famous for being a mercenary state. Many Eorzean city-states made use of the mercenaries from Alamigo in between the years 1100 and 1400. Charlian used them, Ul'dah used them. Alamigo had a stellar reputation for being that strong friend bouncer in the corner that you could trust to beat some heads. But from a cultural standpoint, they weren't known for much more than that. But, like I said, come the late 1400s, Alamigo's economy is about to face complete financial collapse. So, what does their king decide to do? Well, he believes that the best way to jumpstart their economy is with a war, and who better to attack than their pacifist neighbor, the Gridanians. You see, from a historical point of view, Gridania has mostly been a pacifist state. They never really had a huge standing military because the elementals were taking care of all the hostile figures for them. But Alamigo had built up such a big army and was so desperate that Gridania was starting to get overrun, that the elementals themselves were having trouble dealing with all of them. This was known as the Autumn War. The Autumn War was an unprovoked act of violence of Alamigo against Gridania. And not only that, a general in the Alamigan army tricked a Gridanian war hero into peace talks only to poison them. All that talk about Alamigan honor and they poison a guy during peace talks, good lord. Ultimately, Gridania started to have trouble holding Alamigo back even with the elementals' help. So what did they do? They enlisted Limsa-Lominsa, Ul'dah, and Ishgard to help them. Mind you, this is still when Ishgard was in full swings of the Dragon Song War, and they still offered aid. The reason they helped Gridania is because they knew that if Alamigo took over Gridania, they likely wouldn't stop, and they needed to teach the city-state a lesson. So, the united front of the Eorzean alliance beat Alamigo into submission. Needless to say, all the money and costs sunken into Alamigo's military advantages were completely lost, and Alamigo's economy had finally collapsed. But who emerges to save them? Why, the monks from the Fist of Rhalgr, of course. The monks actually moved in and used some political surgery to replace the failing parts of Alamigo's society with some of the methods that they knew would work, because you have to remember, the monks had existed for more than several hundred years already, so they were much older than Alamigo. And thanks to the monks, Alamigo started to recover and find new purpose in the world. Only problem is, less than 100 years later, Theodric I ascends the throne, and the Mad King starts to royally ruin everything. His first act of madness was to set the Temple of the Fist ablaze. You know, the monks that helped stabilize Alamigo after a complete economic collapse? Yeah, apparently everyone was totally okay with putting them to the torch just because their king said so. That event and 5 additional years of wanton murder from King Theodric, and people finally decided that maybe this is bad for Alamigo's health. Everyone revolts against King Theodric and overthrow him, but this came too little, too late, as Garlemald took complete advantage of Alamigo's weakened state and moved in to conquer them, which they did in less than a year because Alamigo was a wreck at this point. So, this is the luxurious history that Ilberd was trying to save. A history of barbarism turned mercenary state, turned aggressive warmongers, turned complete sociopath. Wow, Ilberd, I take it all back. I can see why you want to get back to all that mongering, my friend. So, understanding Alamigo history, you start to understand that Ilberd was in fact a complete moron. Because let's say he survived to see Alamigo liberated. Now what? Their economy is still non-existent. What was he gonna do to replace everything that had failed fundamentally over and over again? He had no overarching plan. He was acting out of spontaneous violence and nothing more. Ilberd wanted to chastise the city-states of Eorzea for being lazy and not rushing to Alamigo's side. But why would any of the Eorzean city-states rush to Alamigo's help when less than 100 years ago they started a war with them? You have to remember, the Autumn War wasn't too terribly long ago. So you have many Pajal from Gridania that clearly remember Alamigo's invasion. So it's no wonder they weren't exactly jazzed at the thought of saving them. Not only that, but Ilberd was so moronic that he wanted all the city-states of Eorzea to go and liberate Alamigo immediately after putting down the 14th Legion. And with the defeat of Gaius von Belsar, the city-states felt that they could finally take a moment to relax, breathe, and recover before eventually dealing with the overarching Garlean threat. The leaders of the city-states weren't stupid. They knew that Garlemald was still a major player and that they would have to deal with them eventually. But of course, they were going to take their time, fortify their outposts, collect resources, and see what Garlemald was going to do next in response to losing the 14th Legion. But of course, that wasn't good enough for Ilberd. It's my city-state and I want it now! So he ultimately tries to help a potato overthrow the Ul'dah leadership, betrays an arrogant child, and then toys with magic way beyond his comprehension. So, did Ilberd get what he wanted? Yes. But thanks to extended timelines, we know that Garlemald would have eventually become desperate enough to use Black Rose, which would not only have killed everyone in Alamigo, but many people in the world as well. But thankfully, we live in the not-so-terrible timeline, and that has nothing to do with Ilberd. And that is why I always found Ilberd to just be a crazed moron. He had no plans for Alamigo's future after its liberation, he just wanted violence. He didn't understand why the city-states of Eorzea didn't immediately rush to Alamigo's aid because he was blinded by pride. And he wasn't cleverly plotting everything in the background, he was simply taking advantage of big wheels that were already way in motion. And then who ultimately takes advantage of him? The Ascians. The Ascians are well known for taking advantage of the short-sighted, foolish, and Ilberd played right into their hands. He was short-sighted and a puppet. Ilberd was no genius, and I will die on this hill. But despite my attempt at comedic ramblings, what do you all think of Ilberd? Do you think Alamigo was worth saving? Or are you like me and think that if he had a little bit more patience, he might have lived to see Alamigo's liberation? Make sure to leave any of your thoughts in the comments below. Share this with your friends, and I hope to see you all very soon. Till then, stay safe, my friends.